Syndicate. My name is Lakshman.
And I'm Benjamin.
And today we have a special episode of the podcast. This is episode 3, whereby we'll be breaking down WWDC, Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference. So we've got lots to dive into. It's been an incredible week. And let's jump on to the news. So WWDC happened this week. It's Apple's annual developer conference. But unlike prior years, this is a significant event because, for starters, we've got a completely revamped, or at least a rethinking to how Apple events are being conducted generally. Because usually events like WWDC are, conducted at like really big halls with massive crowds of people. And again, due to the current pandemic that we're all facing right now, that kind of possibility is sort of out of the picture. But Apple decided to put a twist to what you think of a conventional event. They decided to put a twist onto it. They delivered what I believe is an incredibly well-structured and well-put-together conference. Apple decided to take the route of pre-recording the entire event, editing it, and it's sort of establishing a flow that we've never seen the likes of before at any tech-like event. In my opinion, it sort of, felt like a story. So, Ben, what do you think?
Well, Lakshman, it's actually quite interesting. I must admit, the quality of the production that Apple's presented to the world is, it was actually a very, very intriguing keynote. I was very drawn in. The flow, the transitions, the way it was presented, I think was really, really good. And overall, actually, I think that the content and the style of the production went really well this year. I think, Apple might actually continue to do this, maybe not in WWDC or main events, but they might do this for, somewhat smaller, let's say, product releases. So they might actually continue doing this for smaller releases instead of, let's say, just sending out press releases. And if they indeed do that, I think we can expect a lot of brilliant things to come from Apple in terms of visuals and futuristic video press releases.
That's a pretty interesting fact that you brought to the table, that they might sort of implement this concept moving forwards. And that's quite interesting because I do enjoy the idea of this direction. But at the same time, I was going through some tweets, and I follow a number of developers. And one of them recently voiced out their opinions on the event. And they mentioned that, he mentioned that, yes, this is a fantastic direction, but as a developer and as someone who has attended WWDC in person for a number of years, it still doesn't encapsulate what it feels like to actually be there with the developers in person, with the engineers, with the hands-on labs. This is a fantastic alternative, but moving forwards, yes, it would be interesting to see them implement this sort of style in as you mentioned, product reveals and so on. But I feel like for an event like WWDC that concerns more than just the press, it's an event, it's a week essentially for developers. And a lot of them, who are in the Apple developer community, going to WWDC, getting to be there physically is sort of like the creme de la creme for them as developers. Like they aspire to eventually get there. So, interesting concept. We'll see what Apple chooses to do moving forwards with the idea of events like this. But I have to say I agree with what this developer says. At the end of the day, this is a developer conference. And it just doesn't, encapsulate the feeling of actually being there on site.
Well, actually, I quite agree with you and the developer. Apple's WWDC events, or even their iPhone releases or major product releases, they tend to be a sort of grand theater. And yes, it's true. We would probably not really get a good idea of what that's like unless we're actually there. Perhaps we would one day in the future. Who knows, ladies and gentlemen? If we're lucky enough, if we have that sort of a base and support, we might actually get there one day and actually experience it for ourselves. But for now, I think as a sort of consolation prize, I suppose, I think it's really great what Apple has done so far. It just goes to show you that they may be a tech company, but it's very clear that they're sort of how do I put it? It's sort of like a jack of all trades and master of many things, not just master of one. I think it would be fascinating to see how Apple continues innovating in not just tech areas, but in something as menial as a press and product releases.
Yeah, that's very true. They have proven themselves to essentially adapt, really redefine what we think of as a conventional tech event. All right, moving forward, let's get on with the content of the episode. So iOS 14, Ben, iOS 14. It was such a significant update. You know what? Were you expecting iOS 14 to be as prominent?
Well, to some degree, yes. I mean, in our first episode, we mentioned leaks and rumors of what we could expect in the iOS 14 release. But I think Apple actually has managed to do something really special with iOS this year. It sort of represents a very big shift in design, user interface, and user experience. I suppose the likes of which we've not seen since iOS 7. Now, while I myself have not actually used iOS devices until late last year, I'm actually very excited to see what sort of big changes we can expect. And indeed, if you've used iOS for all your life, there are actually quite significant changes coming your way. And I think the biggest thing that we can expect, now this is coming from an Android user, the biggest thing that we all can expect are widgets on iOS 14. Now, Lex and I actually have the iOS 14 developer beta running on our phones. I don't know. I find the experience to be superbly smooth. And I'll tell you what, I'll let Lakshman tell you his experience as well, because he has experienced the exact same things that I have.
Right, so as mentioned by Ben, yes, we are indeed running the developer betas for iOS 14. Now, I personally have been running developer betas for iOS for the past 5 years, since iOS 9. And this one right here, iOS 14, truly marks an unprecedented change to iOS. Because, moving forward since the beginning, since the early days of iOS, we've all been accustomed to the standard grid of icons that have defined what we know of as iOS. And now with 14, they've added an extra level of interactivity, an extra level of productivity to some extent throughout the entire OS. And this, in my opinion, is a much welcome change. And talking about the beta, it is such an extremely pleasurable experience, and that's rather rare for a beta, because usually when you think of installing a beta, you come across a lot of issues. Like I personally last year, when I installed iOS 13, one of the major issues I faced was my device randomly shuts down a couple of times throughout the day, and that was quite a hassle. But now with 14, I barely notice such issues. In fact, if there are any issues, they're rather minor. But I believe this is a much welcome change. And as we dive into the software moving forwards, you'll see why. And as soon as it's made available, come late September this year, I think we can safely say you'll all have a pleasant experience. What do you have to say, Ben?
Well, I agree fully. So far, the iOS 14 update has been running extremely smooth. It's really stable. Honestly, in some respects, it's actually smoother and more stable than iOS 13, and I'm really surprised at saying that. I'll give you a very good example. Now, in my work, I do have to travel a lot, and the feature introduced in iOS 13.5, where Face Unlock will be able to detect a face mask much faster, and so you can actually just type in your passcode and get into the phone. Now, with iOS 14, I don't have to wait for even, say, half a second. It's, as far as I'm concerned, instantaneous. It's extremely fast, it's extremely smooth. Even though I've not experienced iOS betas in the past, or indeed I've not really experienced Android betas in the past, I think, however, iOS 14 does represent a very big leap forward. And I think many iOS users will be very happy to find that their phones will be much more stable moving forward. Now, Lakshman, what do you make of this?
So as you've mentioned, iOS 14 is a significant change. And one of the biggest changes, in fact, is the introduction of widgets. Now, you've been in the Android world for most of your smartphone experience, so you've come accustomed to widgets. But on the iOS end, we haven't really had widgets. I mean, widgets were introduced in iOS 10, like the side view panel. Whenever you swipe to your left, but they were hidden and you can't really interact with them so much. But now with actual resizable widgets that you can put on your home screen, it adds a level of functionality. Like instead of going into an application, you can glance at it and get the information you need and carry on. It streamlines the experience, in my opinion. And at the same time, it also brings, Apple, when they approach a feature, they will obviously put some sort of twist towards it. And with widgets, this feature, Ben and I, we talked about it prior to this. We love it. So Apple's introduced this feature called Smart Stacks. So it's essentially stackable widgets. So imagine having a widget on your home screen, but you can just swipe the widget and change it to a number of other widgets as well. So this level of interactivity, this level of smoothness and cohesiveness and productivity that you get from a feature like Smart Stacks, that right there is a fundamental change that we've not even seen on the Android end of things. What do you have to say, Ben?
Well, Lakshman, I actually agree quite a bit. Now, widgets on the Android side is actually pretty powerful. It's pretty comprehensive, and it's the one thing that up till now, I think iOS has been severely lacking. Now, iOS has had widgets for quite a while, but it wasn't powerful. It wasn't competent enough. It was stuck at the side. It wasn't at the forefront where you needed your widgets to be. But now things have changed. So take it in this sense, ladies and gentlemen. Not only has Apple provided competent, clear, rich widgets, but they've gone a step above of Android and to provide a multitude of widgets stacked on top one another. And as Lex has mentioned, this is a very powerful, comprehensive tool. So for myself, the layout that I have is that I have this stack of widgets and that's all I have. It's a very clean setup and I don't need any other widgets. Now, you could, of course, choose to add additional widgets if you want. There have been users who have their entire home screens dedicated to widgets only. A very clean layout. While that layout's not for me, I think Smart Stack will make the big difference in how we use iOS devices moving forward. The ability to have multiple things occupy the same space. I think it's a great productivity tool, and I think that many iOS users, power users, or the average iOS user in general can take advantage of. Now, I would like to share another feature that I really do enjoy. Now, this has been going about the social media world, Twitter especially, for quite a while. Perhaps you've heard of it, and this feature is called Backtap. Backtap is basically an additional way that we can interact with our phone. So as the name suggests, if you tap on the back of your phone, you can access certain features. So for example, if you tap the back of your phone twice, you could say, take a screenshot. Or if you tap the back of your phone twice, you could lock the screen. So the options available right now is 2 taps and 3 taps on the back of the phone. While it's a little slow for those accessibility features to work. I would say around half a second. I think it's well worth it. For example, I've set mine to Spotlight Search, which means that right now I can access Spotlight Search anywhere in my device, regardless of whichever app I'm in. And I've set Screenshot to the 3 taps. What do you think of the feature, Lakshman?
That right there is hands down a highlight feature, in my opinion, for iOS 14. Like, I've been using it, and I'm surprised Apple didn't highlight this feature. Maybe because it is an accessibility feature, but getting to try it and getting to actually use it, it adds a level of convenience that was otherwise not present. Whereby just by double tapping the back of your phone, you get to set custom things that this phone can do. Like for mine, my back tap feature is that I back tap the phone, double tap the phone, the back, and I turn it off. That's one. And I triple tap the phone to open my most recent photo. You see, these are things that would otherwise, take a few seconds to do, or you got to reach up and press a physical button. But now just by tapping the back of your phone, you can get it done. That right there it's going to be a game changer. And I feel like, when more and more people are aware of such a feature, you're going to notice the differences as well. So there are plenty of things that have been brought forth with iOS 14. one such feature that was actually highlighted during the keynote was app clips, Ben. So app clips are essentially applications without the download. Like you don't go into the app store to download an app. It works through NFC, and you can essentially have a part of an application on your phone just to use it for a bit, and then it just disappears. I think moving forwards, this feature, it's going to, you're going to see a lot of exciting use cases for it. What do you think?
Well, the way Apple is actually poised the app clips to work, I think so. It'd be quite a powerful tool. Yeah, though I'm not exactly sure to what degree this can be implemented. As far as the ability to, let's say, pay for your meal or pay a parking ticket, as was demonstrated in Apple's keynote, I think is very interesting. So Android has actually had a very similar feature, and it's called Instant Apps. And it works the exact same way. If you tap a particular link or even a QR code or whatever have you, you can access portions of any particular app, say Pinterest or Reddit or whatever have you, and you don't need to actually install the app. You can use it exactly the same way as Apple has advertised it. And of course, after you're done with it, it disappears. So this is a very powerful tool if done right. Now, unfortunately, I have not seen this implemented too much in Android. I have used it here and there, or at the very least, that is to my knowledge. It could be that Android has made it very ubiquitous to the point where I'm using it all the time and I don't particularly recognize it. But of course, Apple's not using this in the same way that Android's doing. The way, again, that Apple has pushed this is so that people can interact with businesses and other organizations in a very quick manner without downloading the app. So it's very interesting to see how this will evolve into the future. Because as we all know, whenever Apple does something, the rest of the industry follows. And I think in regard to Instant App for Android, Google might. I'm not sure if they would, but Google might push forward into developing instant apps more to become a more robust, comprehensive tool under the Android belt.
Right, that's quite true. And as you've mentioned, like the direction that Apple is taking is not your conventional direction. I believe, at least the way it was being demonstrated on stage, was that app clips is essentially a form of convenience that you have with you. Because the scenarios that it depicted, they played a little video, and let's say you're in a foreign city, you want to get on a bike, you want to get on a scooter, and you see them laying around throughout cities nowadays. And instead of going there and you're supposed to download an app and then use it, you can instead get an app clip, use that app for that particular function, and then once you've left the city, that app is no longer relevant to you, so it just disappears. And I can see that being used here in Malaysia, for example. I'm sure some of you have heard of a SoCar. So SoCar is essentially a rent-a-car app, and I've personally seen SoCars scattered throughout the KL and Subang area. And before you get to use a SoCar, you got to download the application on your phone. So instead of doing that, imagine if that was an app clip. I think it would propel the use case for various apps as well, because you don't necessarily have to download it, but you can get the features there and then on the spot. And I think, sum it all up, it's very, very convenient.
I completely agree with your assessments, and we've I don't know. I think it's just a matter of time to assess and see how things work out for Apple and with app clips, and to see if actually Google follows suit or pushes instant apps to be more than it currently is. So I think for iOS 14, that's the bulk of the big updates. Smaller updates include an inline reply feature for iMessage. My God, you have no idea how annoying it is to use iMessage with Lax. He'll send me many lines of text, and I have to reply to them in chronological order. If not, everything will be a lot confusing. If you're in the States, I understand that the primary means of communication, via instant messaging is currently in iMessage. But in every other part of the world, we use apps like, say WhatsApp, WeChat, and whatnot. And with WhatsApp in particular, inline replies has been a feature for a very, very long time. It's extremely convenient. It's actually one of the things that's prevented me from using iMessage more often. I've actually used inline replies with Lax so far. It seems okay, but I think it's still a little buggy. from my experience. So I think Apple is going to continue to work on that. I also do think that Apple will need to tweak it a little more because currently the way it's implemented, if let's say you wanted to reply a particular text, what would eventually happen is that the entire background gets blurred in this translucent sort of effect, and then the reply line is showed prominently. And so when you type a reply, the original message that you want to reply to and your message are prominently displayed. Now, while that's very good to see where the conversation is headed, it's very inconvenient when you want to just view the conversation in general. But that's me as someone who's used WhatsApp very often and actually much prefers it over other sorts of communication apps. But Lex, as someone who uses iMessage very often, what's your experience with the inline reply features thus far?
Yeah, in terms of inline reply, I have to agree with you. It's not very straightforward or intuitive. I still prefer the method that's implemented on apps like WhatsApp, as you mentioned. But I think it's a welcome change because I've been wondering myself for a number of years actually, why don't we have that feature on iMessage? Because it kind of feels it sort of feels like something that should have been there the whole time. You see. And only now do we have it implemented. But the way in which it's implemented, is it bad? No. But is it good? No, it's not. It's more of it's there, I'll get used to it, but it's a welcome change nonetheless. So, in terms of iOS 14, by far another prominent aspect of iOS 14 would have to be the move towards what Apple claims to be a more organized home screen with the introduction of the app library. Now, for those of you that don't know, the app library is essentially a panel will be situated on the far right of your home screen, and it's essentially grouping all of your applications on your phones intelligently via artificial intelligence into specified groups. And when you swipe down, it propels you into a list view in which you can conveniently go through all of the applications that you have on your phone or search them on a conveniently placed search bar on top. So this was Apple's take on what Android has had for essentially quite a number of years with app drawers on Android, and now that we see it on iOS, I'm a little bit mixed on its implementation. Yes, I do enjoy the general feature set that you gain from having an app library, but I don't prefer, or at least I'm not used to Apple's way of organizing the applications intelligently, because certain apps, for example. Apple has organized all my social media apps properly. Like I have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. They're all in one particular folder. However, in a window called Reading and Reference and Reading, I have apps like Medium and News. Yes, that makes sense. But at the same time, I have applications like Maps, Apple Maps, and Waze in Reference and Reading, which doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. And Weather, especially. So yes, it is a convenient feature set, I guess. But at the same time, I feel like Apple can tweak and can work on it a little bit more. However, the list view, that's fantastic. So Ben, what's your take on the app library?
Well, we were actually talking about this before we started recording this episode, and I share the exact same sentiments as you. When I see something which is portrayed to be effectively an app drawer, I expect to see an app drawer. That is to say, when I scroll up or when I scroll right, whatever the app drawer lies, what I expect is this. I expect a whole list of apps which are listed down for ease of use. Lex mentioned the list view, and honestly, I expected the list view to be the app library. But of course, that isn't the case. Apple has decided to group apps into particular. The word folder isn't exactly right. They're sort of pseudo folders. Now it's a little hard to explain here in podcast format. You'd have to look at the photos for yourself to see how it's like. But for now, I'm just going to call it pseudo folder for lack of a better word. Now, like Lax, I also have experienced some oddities in the way Apple arranges things. For example, I have this app called Twitch, And instead of it being lumped under, say, entertainment or video or anything similar to that, it's lumped under creativity. Now, I don't stream, so I'm not sure why that's the case, but it is. I have an app called Taylor, which is a aggregate of multiple screenshots, sort of a deal, and it's also posted under creativity when it should be under utilities, and on it goes. Now, I think, however, that Apple has plenty of time to make amends and to fix the algorithm that is in charge of sorting these apps out. That's not the issue. It's a very minor issue. My primary gripe is that I think there isn't necessarily a need to arrange apps in this way. Again, as Lax has mentioned, the list view of all of your apps, I think that's a lot better. You can actually reach your apps a lot quicker, I think. And because it's listed in alphabetical order, you'll know via muscle memory where your apps should lie. And I think that's very important because in Android, it's more or less the same situation. Even if you say a heavily skinned Android operating system, like say Samsung, you get to choose how your app drawer is organized. Do you want it to be organized alphabetically, or do you want it to be custom? Or perhaps it is done via, whichever apps you have most recently installed. That various options I don't think Apple will implement, but I think at the very least, giving us an alphabetical order app drawer without going through this hassle of weird pseudo folders and an additional step to get to our apps would be a good step forward. Now, that being said, as much as I want to remove the app library, I think Apple's pretty adamant. Now, that being said, I've only used this for a few days actually, this particular feature. So it might be that because of the limited nature of the app library, I've not gotten used to it. I'm more used to how Android is doing things. In fact, I used Nova Launcher on my Samsung before the Android 10 update, and Nova Launcher allowed me to customize my app drawer in a whole host of ways, and I think I'm very used to that. But I think for perhaps, the average iOS user, perhaps they might find it very useful. They might actually really, really enjoy that. So I think it's a matter of waiting and see how the general public views this. And it'll be very interesting to see how that works. In conjunction with the app library, ladies and gentlemen, you tell me, and Lakshman, you should tell me too, because I think you face this issue quite a bit. Have you ever downloaded a billion apps on your phone and found out that you have to scroll through 1,000 times before reaching the app you want? Or that you have to remember the name of your app, and so you have to go through Spotlight and type and search the app? Well, ladies and gentlemen, no more do you have to worry about that, because finally you can remove those additional home screens that you do not want. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's why Apple has the app library. I may not necessarily agree with the way it's implemented, but it's there for a good reason, and I think it's long overdue. It is a really fantastic way to it's to organize your home screen and to keep it as less cluttered as possible. And of course, with the addition of widgets, I think you'll be able to pull this off quite easily. So, Lex, what's your views on this? What are your views on the ability to remove home screens? Aren't you very glad?
Oh, yes, I believe that is a much welcome change because, as you've mentioned, lots of people out there, including myself, I had like 4 panels of apps, 4 pages of apps. And right now, getting to remove most of them, not only does it streamline the overall use case for me when I use my phone, whereby only my most essential apps are on the home screen, or, well, most of them now are just widgets. And the rest of it I can access through the app drawer or through Siri suggestions. So this right here has truly streamlined the overall use case for the phone. Instead of scrolling through window page after page after page just to look for a particular application, all your most important apps are in front of you, just 1 or 2 windows away, and anything else is in the app library. Again, a very streamlined approach. Another feature that I think is much welcomed in the iOS world, that's actually been around in the Android side of things for quite a while, would have to be picture-in-picture, native picture-in-picture support in iOS. Now, for those of you that don't know, picture-in-picture is essentially a feature that allows you to have let's say you're watching a particular movie on Netflix or on Apple TV Plus. And prior to iOS 14, when you exit the application, your video stops playing. But now, with picture-in-picture, it lets you exit the application and have a tiny little window will pop up where where you can watch your particular show that you're watching, and you can continue to do something else. Let's say I'm watching a movie, I can have a little window that's playing that movie while I'm on WhatsApp or iMessage or doing something else. And the best part is it's resizable. You can place it up, down, left, right, even push it away to the side. That right there is an incredible feature, and especially for those of you out there who consume a lot of media on applications like Netflix, you're going to love it. Now, this isn't a new feature per se. Apple has had it with the iPad since iOS 9, actually. But only now is it made available on the iPhone. And Android has had this feature before. But Ben, how has it been like on Android? And also talk about experiences with picture-in-picture in iOS.
Let me answer in reverse order. So my experience with picture-in-picture on iOS so far has been really great. And again, this is a beta, and I'm really amazed as to how smooth it works. Not only are you able to get your work done while you're, let's say, listening to a podcast or watching a video, whatever have you, you're able to resize it. I think this resizing feature is really useful. Sometimes you want a greater attention to the video you're watching, but perhaps you need to look at some other app and view the content on that app. And sometimes you don't want it to distract you, so you can either pinch to make it smaller, or you can move it to the side. That's right, you can move the video to the side and carry on with your work. So it doesn't disturb you. The audio will carry on playing without pausing. I think it's really wonderful. So far, I'm actually very, very pleased with how picture-in-picture works on iOS. Now on Android, well, at the very least on my Samsung Galaxy S10, picture-in-picture, of course, has worked for quite a while, even since Android 9. However, the problem with picture-in-picture in Android is that it's really buggy and it's stuttery. It lags quite a bit if, let's say, you go between the picture-in-picture mode and the background app. Even before this podcast, I was fiddling around with it. And if you go between the two modes too often, what you find is that the buttons, which if you press, it's supposed to get back to full screen, that stops working. And on YouTube Premium, there's an option for you to just get rid of the video and just listen to the audio. Even that gets buggy and stops working, which is, honestly, it's quite frustrating. I live with it. I've lived with it so far because Android hasn't had that feature. But Lax, it's very interesting because Apple gives you the ability to shove the video to the side and just listen to the audio. There's no buttons to be pressed. You don't need to do anything special. Move it to the side, left or right, whichever you like. And there you go. It stays there. You can't do that on Android, sadly. So with YouTube Premium, you can just listen to the audio, but you need to first tap the picture and then press the headphone icon, which will then allow you to just listen to the audio. So there's no seamless way to just get rid of it temporarily and get the picture-in-picture mode back. There is no resizing feature in Android 10, but that's a feature coming in Android 11. So I don't personally find it to be a big deal. However, I'm concerned that Google hasn't optimized picture-in-picture enough for it to be running smoothly, even though there's the ability to now resize the videos in Android 11. So all in all, I think Apple actually has done a really good job. Indeed, Lax has mentioned again and again, Apple has introduced this feature. It's a feature that Android has had. I've mentioned it as well. And indeed, it's actually sort of a joke right now. It's a meme. This is the year where iOS becomes more and more like Android. And, it is funny, I look at a lot of Android users, they're laughing their butts off. And fair enough, it's really funny. It's really amusing. But I do think that all of this just simply means iOS is even close to parity in terms of features with Android. And I think that's really bad news for Google and for Android as a whole. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we've not discussed Android 11 on the show. We're not going to discuss it on this particular episode. Perhaps we'll address it in another episode. But I'll tell you right now, as an Android user, I'm very underwhelmed by what the update brings. And even more so in the light of iOS 14. I was already unimpressed with Android 11. Indeed, certain features which were actually asked for, which were really sought after, were just shoved to the wayside in more recent beta updates for the Android 11 update. Time will tell as to how the software performs, but I'm letting you know now, ladies and gentlemen, and as well as Lex, I've already talked to you. I've mentioned this to you quite a few times. I think Google really needs to watch out. I think they're in great danger that if they keep being complacent, if they're not going to optimize their feature sets properly, I think they're going to see an exodus of Android users going into iOS because it's becoming more and more comprehensive and competent.
It's quite an interesting take there, because I'm going to address a few things that you mentioned. So yes, picture in picture, to sum it all up, Apple has taken a very, very smooth and essentially a very natural experience towards picture in picture. And that is, again, very, very welcome. Whereas on the Android end, it's a little janky, to say the least. Yes, I agree with you on the memes. There are quite a number of memes that have addressed how iOS is essentially mimicking or becoming more and more like Android. But however, there is a fundamental difference here. And I was talking to you about this earlier before the podcast. So essentially, with what Apple is doing right now by introducing various features that Android has had, for example, widgets, even app clips and an app library and so on, they've been around on Android for most of its existence. But at the end of the day, I believe a feature is only successful when it's being implemented and utilized by a large number of people. That's number one. And also number two, Apple has, as an Apple user and as people that use Apple products, I believe we've all grown accustomed to the standard layout of iOS. Even if you give an iPhone from the year 2007 or 2008, like an iPhone 3G or the very first iPhone today, to someone who has not used the private iPhones from back then, they will still know the general gist of how to navigate the device, as opposed to, using an Android phone from many, many years ago. So the idea here is Apple has familiarized its operating system towards individuals, and that's why they tend to use more of the feature sets. So I think now Apple is giving you that option, such as widgets, such as features like app clips and app libraries and so on. But they're not forcing change onto their users. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, even when you update your phone to iOS 14, it will still be the same general grid of apps that you've always known and loved for so long. Only when you choose to implement the change, you can do so. It isn't something like, oh wow, how do I use this again? And I think that is quite an interesting approach that Apple is taking. No doubt these features have been on Android for, again, a number of years now. But I believe now with what Apple is doing, it sort of pushes the use case of widgets, the use case of app libraries and picture-in-picture. It pushes and elevates the use case of a smartphone towards non-tech people, in which they will start using it. And I believe this will also trickle down to Android users who are not tech individuals per se, who use Android phones. They will start using these features. They will start implementing it. Because the moment Apple enters a market, the general trend is that the rest of the market tends to follow what they do. So it is a welcome change, and I think it's a win on both ends, in my opinion. So that's pretty much it, Ben, for iOS 14. So, all right, shall we dive into Mac OS?
Yes, let's do. Yes. So I think the thing about Mac OS that strikes me the most is not the feature sets, but the name of Mac OS. It's called Mac OS Big Sur. That's Sur with a U, so SUR, not SIR. It is an actual place It's not just some random location. Apple's still carrying on with their naming Mac OS after regions in California, and I suppose eventually the United States in general. The name aside, the thing that makes Mac OS Big Sur particularly important is that it's not Mac OS 10. Apple has decided to move to the next level. They have now labeled Big Sur macOS version 11, and this is a huge step forward, I think, for macOS. So, Lex, you've been a macOS user for many. Well, I suppose for all your life. I've never used macOS in a meaningful way. So, why don't you share your thoughts on Big Sur and let us know if you've actually installed the thing on your laptop?
Right. So, as you've mentioned, Big Sur is a big departure from what what we've known with Mac OS, because Mac OS has traditionally been an operating system that many people have grown accustomed to. Because both the professionals utilize it in their fields as well as us consumers here. So it's not desktop operating systems tend to get less change as opposed to mobile operating systems in the long run. And Big Sur is essentially a massive stepping stone that Apple is transitioning that will essentially define the future of the Mac. And as you've mentioned before this, yes, this is no longer Mac OS 10, this is Mac OS version 11. So Mac OS 10 was introduced back in March 24th, 2001. So nearly after almost 19 years, we are now transitioning into the next phase of macOS, and we've got a number of relevant changes. So for me personally, I have not installed the beta on my Mac because based on reports, the Big Sur beta has been quite buggy. Like, I know a friend of mine running it on his 15-inch MacBook Pro, and it's been pretty bad. So I utilize my Mac for a lot of important work-related things. So I do not want to compromise my workflow. But eventually, if the betas get better moving forwards, which they will, I just might jump on board. So, if you're going to talk about macOS Big Sur, we have to address the interface, because macOS Big Sur got a refined user interface with its introduction. So, to put things lightly, the user interface inconsistencies between Apple's mobile and desktop operating systems are quite notable. And in fact, when you compare iOS, macOS, the look, you can differentiate. Like, iOS looks modern and fresh and futuristic, while macOS still sometimes feels a little dated. And then with macOS Yosemite, introduced a few years ago, that's when they redesigned some of the icons to make it a bit more iOS-like. But I felt like macOS was stuck in what I would call an awkward stage between macOS Yosemite and right now before Big Sur, with the current release being Catalina, whereby macOS looked very inconsistent because you have both an iOS-like design mixed with the traditional Mac user interface. I personally believe that was not a very pleasing visual aesthetic. But right now at Big Sur, they've essentially redesigned everything. All the icons got completely redesigned. We've got iOS-like features like Control Center on macOS, and a number of design changes that have essentially refined and flattened the user interface that makes it look a lot like a mobile-based operating system. And I think that's a good thing in terms of design, because it gives macOS a fresh coat of paint, one that it's desperately been needing for quite a number of years now. So, Ben, what's your take on the look and feel of macOS Big Sur?
Well, unlike many Mac users themselves, they've complained about it. For me, I personally think they look well. It looks pretty good. The user interface and user experience thus far seems to be very clean. It definitely matches more with iOS and iPadOS and the like. It's more cohesive than ever before in terms of design. And that being said, I don't think I can actually offer too much insight, but I can give you what other people have actually experienced on this and report on that. So Quinn Nelson of Snazzy Labs, he has actually quite a few things to complain about it. Chief among which is that the buttons, interactive elements of the user interface are not clear anymore. For example, I have no idea what it's called, but it's the top bar. I believe it's called the Finder bar. I'm not sure what it is, but essentially the drop-down menu of the top bar, it's now translucent. Now, while it does look very good, if matched with the wrong kind of wallpaper, you'll find that you can't actually differentiate between the interactable elements and uninteractable elements. Now, again, I don't use macOS, so sadly, I can't even tell you I can't give you examples of that. But you can actually go to YouTube and check out Snazzy Labs. It's one of his more recent videos regarding his qualms and issues with the current user interface. Then he also has an issue with other interactable elements in opened windows in Big Sur. So, for example, there used to be very clear buttons laid out in the interface, and you could tell this is an interactable element. You could tell that you would need to reach your mouse to at least this point, this part of your screen, for you to be able to interact with it. But currently, it's just flat. And the issue with that on a desktop, as he puts it, is that you can't really tell where the borders of the buttons are. So you're not sure when you're not sure if you could interact with it or not interact with it. And so the way to actually know whether or not you can interact with it is to actually hover your mouse over the icon itself. And then there'll be a sort of a hover element that will show you the button borders, and it'll tell you whether or not you can interact with it. So based on Quinn's experience, it seems to look good. It looks very nice, but the use case itself is not excellent. It's not up to par. Mainly because I suppose people have been so used to Mac OS 10 and the layout and the design that it's really hard to get used to something so jarring, where the change is so great. I remember when people had many complaints about the transition from Windows 7 to Windows 8, the transition from 8 to 8.1, and then a further transition from 8.1 to Windows 10. So I am sympathetic with Quinn's qualms over here. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not the worst part. I think, Lax, you know what I mean. You've seen the memes. You've seen the green nipple. That horrendous battery bar, which is inside one of the settings in macOS Big Sur, that looks ugly. It belongs in the late 90s, ladies and gentlemen. It generally doesn't belong on an Apple product, let alone an Apple product in 2020. I'm going to say, and I'm going to guess, that Apple's going to change this particular icon in that particular setting. But I'll just say it's a pretty jarring thing. It's a meme all over the place.
Right, I completely agree with you on the redesigned battery icon, and I feel like that icon right there should be redesigned, because many users who have installed macOS Big Sur have voiced out their frustrations with this odd-looking design element. So that's the thing, the design of macOS Big Sur has been rather controversial, to say the least, because, again, it is a drastic departure from what we're used to. But at the same time, I'm at least on my end, I believe like a lot of the changes in terms of the design are welcomed, a vast majority of them. There are, again, one or two nuances that drastically need to be removed and improved. But I think this freshened layout essentially defines where the Mac is going, and we will touch on this later on when we talk about the transition to Apple Silicon. But right now, based on how Mac OS is and moving forwards, it's going to be an awkward, at least an awkward couple of years. But once the transition has been completed, I think Big Sur, or at least Apple operating systems for the Mac moving forwards, will make a lot of sense, actually. So another such headline feature for macOS Big Sur is, for me at least personally, messages. So prior to this, we all know that iMessage on iPhones and iPads have been very interactive, various features that you can use and so on. But on the Mac, however, they've completely disregarded the Messages app prior to this, whereby it's just bland and boring. You don't have all these features that you have on iOS over on the Mac. And now we have a more iOS-like experience in Messages on the Mac, finally. So these little nuances, again, push and indicate the direction that macOS is taking, whereby it's not just taking cues anymore from mobile operating systems like iOS. It is becoming a new form of OS that is taking a large chunk of its inspiration from mobile operating systems that we've had, like iOS and iPadOS. So Ben, do you agree with the idea that with macOS being such a drastic departure, do you think, at least moving forwards, that the implications of Big Sur will have a lasting impact on Mac users in general?
Well, I'm actually not sure how to answer that, because again, I've been a lifelong PC user, but let me try in the best possible terms to give an analogy with my use of Windows to Mac OS, and in particular, let me draw an analogy from Windows 8.1 to Windows 10. Now, like Mac OS Catalina, Windows 8.1 was plagued with a lot of issues and complaints from users. People were still very unhappy with the start screen. It was a horizontal scrolling list that went on forever, sort of like iOS, but even worse, if you could believe it. Although there were some improvements from Windows 8, there were plenty of things that people complained about, but people got used to it. And of course, Windows 10, when it eventually came, it was welcomed. There was a sleek design. The start menu came back. The traditional start menu came back. And I think for Big Sur, while not exactly like the transition from 8.1 to Windows 10, I think by and large it's going to be a very welcome change by many, many Mac users. Yes, I think there are certain elements that still needs to be tweaked. For example, that top bar and its drop-down menu certainly needs to be tweaked. The transparency is really causing a lot of issues with differentiating between interactable and non-interactable elements. But I think beyond I call it minor, but perhaps for Mac users it might be a little major. But in my perspective, it's something minor, and I think Apple could probably get away with it. And as you've mentioned, with Apple integrating more and more features from iOS into macOS, it creates an even more cohesive ecosystem than ever before. Now, what this would mean going forward and how would things evolve over time is a little difficult to tell, because Apple's notorious for being really secretive. And in fact, it was really lucky that we managed to get any leaks at all, thanks to John Prosser. But yes, I think the direction in which Apple is headed, it should earn them some respect and levity and comfortability from the Mac community. I forgot to mention actually, one tiny feature, but I think which would be appreciated by many, which is also which I could draw a very perfect analogy from Windows 8.1 to Windows 10. I mentioned earlier that with Windows 10 came the return of the traditional start menu. And with Big Sur, ladies and gentlemen, the Mac OS startup music returns. Now, I suppose if you're relatively young, perhaps you can't really appreciate it, especially if you've gotten a new Mac, or rather Mac in recent years. But I think Lakshman and many other Mac OS users miss this sound. It is an iconic sound. Don't you think, Lax? What do you think of it?
That is very true, because the iconic Mac OS chime has disappeared with Mac OS High Sierra, and that was almost 5 years ago. And now that they've brought it back, every time you unlock your Mac, you hear this really high-pitched chime, and I think that right there defined what the Mac was, for a long time. And seeing it come back, I'm not gonna lie, it does pull some really heartwarming strings, and it's a welcome change. And I like how you related that with the return of the start menu with Windows 10. That was a very lovely way to tie it all up. So more changes in Mac OS. Safari got quite a number of changes. Apple has claimed that Safari is now 50% faster than Google Chrome. There's now a privacy toolbar that can show you web trackers and also display full privacy reports that essentially shows you a list of your block trackers for the past 30 days. Also, there's now the ability to, Apple has put it more focus on extensions made by third parties in Safari. Developers can essentially get tools to convert Google Chrome extensions into ones they can use in Safari. So I think that's quite a useful feature. Again, the Photos feature, Photos app also got redesigned. It's very iOS-like. Same goes for the Maps app for macOS. So all in all, macOS Big Sur takes a lot of cues from iOS, but at the same time, it is essentially becoming something that is foreign, but at the same time familiar. I think all of this will make sense once we dive into Apple Silicon later on. But as of right now, yes, it's a welcome change. It's a fresh coat of paint. Certain things have to be fixed, but generally, I love it. So now I want to talk about one feature in macOS Big Sur that is quite a substantial feature. Now, this is called Catalyst. So a brief introduction. So Catalyst was introduced by Apple last year. And essentially, it allows developers to bring iOS apps to the Mac. You can port iOS applications and use them on your Mac. And Apple says that Catalyst has been updated so that apps can now take advantage of the Mac's wide display as well as its native resolution. Therefore, developers will also have access to new menus and keyboards and APIs that they can use to make using iOS apps on the Mac a less janky experience. But I have tried Catalyst apps on the Mac, like voice memos, podcast, and so on. And at least the first-party apps that we got right now, they have been quite janky. I don't think the user interface is optimized for the Mac yet. But I feel like right now, more and more developers are jumping on board. And even Craig Federighi did recently say that Catalyst is not a project that's only going to span like a few months. It's going to be a multi-year project that will be updated as the years progress. And I think it's good because in a way, this is indicating the flexibility of Apple ecosystems, of the Apple ecosystem, and how they essentially want to not necessarily combine, but provide a unified experience throughout their operating systems, various operating systems. So Ben, what's your take on Catalyst?
Well, actually sounds very familiar because while it's not exactly the same, Windows did try to do the same thing to unify their operating systems with Windows 10. So for those of you who actually know the existence of Windows Mobile 10, or rather Windows Phone 10, it was essentially software that could be changed and molded depending on the form factor and the specifications of the device. So, for example, you could take a phone, plug it into your monitor or your PC or whatever, and a version of Windows 10 would also appear on the screen. It's not an emulation, it's an actual version of Windows 10. Now, of course, because of the technical limitations of the phone, it wasn't that great. But it showed you where Microsoft wanted to go. Now, unfortunately, as some of you might know, and some of you might have guessed it already, Windows Phone 10 did not make it. It died a sad and very lonely death at the negligence of Microsoft. May God burn Microsoft and its executives in technology hell. Oh, well, what a shame. Now, with Catalyst, I think it's going to be a little different because of the higher level of integration that Apple has with its ecosystem. Yes, when you're doing things for the first time, they're going to be really rough around the edges. I think that's to be expected. But I think over time, and especially with what we're going to talk about later, stay tuned for that, ladies and gentlemen. What we're going to talk about later, I think Catalyst will become a very, very important tool set inside the Apple ecosystem to make things run better than ever before. So as you've mentioned, currently it's not, it doesn't work particularly well. The user interface is a bit rough. The way that things are done is not necessarily the best. But with Apple's plans and with Apple's upcoming plans over the next 2 years, and again we'll get to that soon, I think Catalyst will become a feature which will be at the forefront of what Apple does. Because essentially what's going to happen is that an app that is on an iPhone or an iPad will now be able to run on a Mac efficiently, smoothly, and with the changes that has been made in Big Sur, it will look, well, hopefully good.
Okay, as you've mentioned, Project Catalyst makes a lot of sense, moving forward for the future of the Mac. And I think its implications will be felt for years to come. And generally, I think Big Sur in general is an update that will profoundly bring change to the importance of Mac OS as a legacy operating system and how it's going to be transcended into an operating system that will be relevant for years to come. Because I believe the issue with most legacy operating systems like Mac OS and Windows in particular is that a lot of people have grown accustomed to the general layout and look and feel of desktop-based operating systems. And change isn't necessarily, or at least big change is not necessarily a welcomed thing. But now, as we transcend into the future, and as mobile devices have, over the course of the last decade, have creeped into our life, we begin to reach an inflection point here, whereby you have legacy technologies like the Mac, and you have technologies like iPhones, iPads, Apple Watch, AirPods. How do you unify all of this? Because if you don't, that's going to be a big problem moving forwards. And I think with what Apple is doing now with Big Sur and Project Catalyst, it will make sense. The road to unify everything will be a little bumpy, yes, definitely. But the end goal is something that I think it will benefit all of us, both traditional users of Mac OS as well as new users who are new to the Mac. So that's pretty much it for Mac OS, Big Sur. Can't get enough of that name. And now let's talk about some of the minor things that were introduced at WWDC. So watchOS 7 was introduced. So for all of you Apple Watch users out there, watchOS 7, the two highlight features were essentially sleep tracking. There's also a new workout feature called dancing. So now Apple Watch can track your dance workouts, and it can track a variety of dances from hip hop to more traditional based dances, even Bollywood style dances. So that's interesting. Another uncanny feature that was introduced with watchOS 7 is called this new hand washing feature. Because now we're all living in during an era where the pandemic is quite prevalent, personal hygiene is of course at the forefront of what we do. So now we're all advised to wash our hands for at least 20 seconds. So if you wear an Apple Watch and you wash your hands, Apple Watch will essentially detect and know that you're washing hands. And the way in which it does that is quite interesting, because it uses it by detecting the sounds. It recognizes the sound of running water and the movement of your hand. And it essentially sets a timer of sorts that will send you haptic feedback for 20 seconds to ensure that you wash your hands for 20 seconds. So I think it is a welcomed feature for the period of time that we're all going through right now, as personal hygiene is something we all have to take seriously. So that's interesting in watchOS 7. Other than that, we also got the introduction of the implementation of third-party watch faces. Well, that can now run natively on the Apple Watch. Now, there's no third-party app store for watch faces, but watch face store essentially. But we do have the ability to have native watch faces on the Apple Watch, so that's welcome. Another slightly minor software that got a minor tweak was, of course, iPadOS. A lot of the applications in iPadOS now have this window-like layout whereby you have a sidebar that has all of the, like in the Photos app, when you view your photos or whatever, you will have a sidebar that will essentially show you the different categories available. So that's welcomed. As well as for iPad OS, we also get the widgets that we see on iOS, but they are rather limiting. They are not like how they are on iOS. You can't place them everywhere and resize them. They still exist at the side panel. And also Apple Pencil features have been boosted quite significantly. Now there's a new feature called Scribble, whereby you can write. For example, you want to type out a URL. Instead of typing it out, you can just write a URL, or at least write a website's name on the search bar, and it will immediately translate your written text into a digital input. And I think that right there is a rather convenient feature. So that's pretty much it for software related stuff. So Ben, are you ready to transition into what I would think is the biggest announcement made at WWDC? Are you ready, Ben?
Oh, yes, I am. But I'll tell you who's not ready for this, and that's Intel. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for the third time, third time in Apple's history, they are making the transition, the move, into making their own silicons for their computers, for their desktop and laptops, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is really exciting because thus far, we've not really seen ARM-based chips to be competent in desktop or laptop computing. Microsoft's tried it. They've tried it for a really long time. It's always failed again and again and again and again. In their most recent attempt with the Microsoft Surface X, I'm afraid it also falls short. But Apple, as you understand, is not like most other companies. Their processors on their phones and their tablets are it is not among, but it is indeed the world's most powerful mobile processors. So this is huge news for Apple. This gives them a chance to highly integrate all of their systems from top to bottom, left to right. No stones will be left unturned as far as Apple is concerned. So Lex has mentioned Catalyst. We've mentioned the change into Big Sur and making everything streamlined, making Macs streamlined with iOS and iPad OS. And this is the spark that will make all of that happen. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned who wasn't particularly prepared, and I mentioned it was Intel. Now, I suppose that's a bit of a lie. I'm sure Intel has the intel on what Apple has been doing. And I'm afraid, things don't look to be too well for them. Not only has AMD been killing it in the desktop computing space, they're starting to creep in on Intel in the laptop space as well. And now here you have Apple, whom last I've checked held about 12% of the PC market. And that's 12% of, I don't know, that's several $1 billion, ladies and gentlemen, gone. Intel has lost all of that revenue. Now, of course, it's nothing new. There will be customers who come and go, and I suppose Apple is not much different. But it's truly, truly amazing that Apple is able to make this accomplishment. They're able to leave Intel behind and pursue their own chips. Now, Apple announced a 2-year transition for all of their machines. Originally, what I thought, and I've had this discussion with Lakshman, I believe a few weeks back, we've actually had this conversation regularly. Now, what I thought was, well, okay, Apple's going to transition, and they're going to have their MacBook Air line up, switch to their own in-house custom silicon. A recent video from Linus Tech Tips gave insight into the cooling layout in the MacBook Air, and it appeared as if it was not suitable for Intel chips, but it would be very suitable for an ARM-based processor, which does not give out the same sort of heat output rather, and does not draw in that much power. So I think Apple more or less has their design ready to be shipped. But what really surprised me, and genuinely, this is quite a surprise, they're going to power their professional machines with this as well. And so I think the reason why there's a 2-year transition period is that they need time to create extremely powerful processors to be put in the likes of, say, their 16-inch MacBook Pro, their iMac Pro, and their Mac Pro. These are devices that are currently running on Intel's highest end processors. And it's really required because if you're going to do professional work, you need extremely capable and powerful processors. And so the opinion in the community right now is that they'll eventually move on to all of their Pro machines at the end of the 2-year transition because, it's going to take time for them to transition. Now, in the meantime, I believe Apple has announced that they will be releasing a few Intel products for this year and perhaps the next year. But eventually you'll see more and more Apple-based silicon being released into their machines. Now, Lax, you've been a Mac user all your life. How do you take this news? First Apple was using PowerPC, and then there was a huge transition into Intel, and now they're moving into their own in-house silicon. What's your view on this?
Right. So again, this is a truly profound move on Apple's half for the Mac, because for quite a number of years now, Intel has proven to be quite unreliable. Not only for Apple as a client, but Intel processors in general. For the past 5 generations of Intel processors, they've all been delayed from the original deadline. And Apple doesn't like this because, again, it causes them to change their roadmap, in which they will not be able to release Macs, at least new Macs, in a timely manner. And that has taken quite a strain on the industry. So this move has essentially propelled Apple to essentially unify the Mac even more and integrate it even more into its ecosystem, but at the same time propel the Mac into new uncharted waters, whereby soon I believe the Mac will be able to do more things that are what would seem impossible with current Intel-based processors. So there's an important thing when you discuss a transition of this magnitude. So, as you've mentioned, this isn't the first transition for the Mac. The Mac has been running on PowerPC, and then it's transitioned to Intel back in 2006. Now, when Steve Jobs introduced the transition from PowerPC to Intel, that was a truly historic day for Apple. But with any transition of this magnitude comes a number of issues. Issues to do with how would x86 chips-based applications work on ARM-based chips moving forwards, sort of making sure everything is a cohesive experience. And the way Apple is going to do this is the same way they did it back with the transition to Intel. They introduced this platform called Rosetta. Now, Rosetta essentially is a software that would enable developers to translate existing Intel-based x86 applications and ensure that they run flawlessly and smoothly on ARM-based Macs. That is a very, very important thing, and that right there is a step in the right direction, so that everybody who has an app who works with macOS applications, they will be able to transition to ARM-based Macs with ease, allowing for both the applications to work on Macs that run Intel, as well as future Macs that will run ARM, that will have ARM-based chips inside. So one of the things that I'm most excited for in this transition is, if you've noticed when we're talking about macOS Big Sur, we're talking about all the various differences brought to the operating system with Big Sur. And I believe with the introduction of the first ARM-based Mac, and we've got a confirmation, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a rumor, this is straight out of Tim Cook's mouth, we will see our first ARM-based Mac by the end of this year. Oh boy, I am excited. Well, as to what Mac it's going to be, I don't know, but the first Mac to have ARM will come this year. And I believe that this ARM-based Mac will it will certainly not be a traditional Mac, at least the Macs that we currently have right now. It is going to look different, and with the integration of Big Sur, it is going to feel different. And there have been speculation going on right now, at least with people that are running Big Sur. Big Sur in general feels like an operating system that you want to reach out and touch, you see? And I believe that, this is an indication that the Mac will see more a more touch-based interface, at least with the move to ARM moving forwards. Because Big Sur is a software that some elements of it just demand you to reach out and touch it. So that's quite an interesting take. Ben, what do you think?
I think that's a very interesting perspective. I've actually not heard of that before. But I suppose it would make sense that Apple would move to some degree, at least, in this direction. With iPad OS, they've certainly made the move to make it more PC-like. So it wouldn't be a stretch, I think, to say that Apple is planning to make Big Sur, or rather some reincarnation of Mac OS 11, to be touch-based. Now, I don't know if the Mac, if this Mac laptop coming, or whatever machine it is coming later this year, will be touch-enabled. So far, the UI elements does not seem to be fully in line with that. But I think eventually Apple would get to the point where they might begin to allow to having touch interface within Mac OS. Now, you mentioned Rosetta earlier, and I think that would play a very key role, because the fear is for so long when it comes to these kinds of transitions, which is why you don't really see Windows making the same sorts of transitions, by the way, is that there tends to be an overhead that you need to pay for when designing one app that is to be compiled and read and to run in a completely different system architecture. I think Rosetta 2 is a very good reincarnation of what Apple is trying to do. It, of course, runs real time and dynamically to reduce these overheads and to ensure that you don't feel like in any drop in speed. And I just wanted to make that comment about Rosetta, because I think people need to understand the grand implication of this new tool that Apple has developed. It's not easy. It's actually really, really complicated. But by and large, I think this move to their own in-house based silicon, as I've mentioned earlier, and as you've mentioned and alluded to much earlier in this episode, it's going to have a significant impact in the integration of macOS, iOS, iPadOS, the whole suite of what we call the Apple ecosystem. And I actually would like to see where it moves forward. And I would like to see, extremely thin Macs. Now, I believe you've mentioned much earlier to me regarding this upcoming Mac, that it is your belief, or rather your prediction, that it's not exactly going to be cheap, that it would either remain at about the same price, that we would have to pay the same sort of Apple tax, or that it actually might be more expensive. Now, I hold hope that at the very least, if Apple does not have to pay these high premiums that Intel is demanding on their chips, that at the very least Apple could make a move to make a relatively cheap Mac. And I think there is good evidence to suggest that they might end up doing this, considering their moves in more recent years with the iPhone. And a few years earlier, they did this with the iPads. Like, the iPads are actually pretty affordable and yet very, very competent, powerful machines. So that is my hope. It's speculation. I really don't know how Apple's going to price, what Apple is actually going to do. I hope that John Prosser and his leaks could get something out, although apparently one of his leaks got found out. May he rest in peace. So I suppose we'll just have to see where that leads us on, and what the future holds. And I think the ladies and gentlemen out there can expect us to, maybe not review, but perhaps to take a look at what the new ARM-based machine will bring us. And who knows, perhaps by then we might have some funds to buy it. I would be very interested to purchase one, were it priced right. How about you, Lux? I think so. You mentioned that you wanted to buy an ARM-based machine and sell off your current MacBook Pro. Is that right?
Right. So on my end, for me, I told myself this: the next Mac I buy will 100% be an ARM-based MacBook, hands down. So with this transition, with the 2-year period, whenever they do update their MacBook Pros with ARM-based processors, that's when I'm definitely going to jump on board. Now, during the event, we got to see again what was it like to have an ARM-based chip running macOS Big Sur. So Apple has essentially built a system that has the current A12Z chip, the same chip that's on the latest 2020 iPad Pros, in a Mac Mini that is currently running their demo systems right now. And that blew my mind away because honestly, they demoed applications like Final Cut Pro for editing, and how you could have 4 streams of 4K video and play them back at full resolution and add transitions, text while the video is playing. That right there, you cannot even begin to imagine to do something like that on a Intel-based machine. And the same goes to Adobe apps like Photoshop and Illustrator and so on. Big files are now, at least a lot of layers being incorporated within the application. Your machine doesn't slow down. It feels a lot more fluid. And by far the biggest welcome change that I'm looking forward to with the move to Apple Silicon is that Macs finally won't heat up as easily as they do, because this isn't just to do with MacBooks in general, but personal computers, PCs in general, desktops and laptops. They tend to heat up a lot. Even for some really basic tasks, the fans start kicking in and they get really loud and they start, having all sorts of issues. But with ARM-based machines, like our mobile phones and iPads, for instance, you don't see any of that. For example, the iPad Pro right now, the latest generation, it can edit 4 streams of 4K video and do all of that without a fan. It does not have a fan inside. So that kind of performance being implemented on a Mac, that is a very welcome change, and I think one that will truly set a new stage for where the Mac is going. Now, as for the cost of this first ARM-based Mac, I hope that Apple cuts the price down. I hope, but one of the reasons why I don't think they will is I can assure you that this next Mac coming out will have a drastic design departure from current Apple-based Macs. It's going to look very, very different. And that design results in, again, that Apple premium that we all pay for. So that could be one of the reasons. But generally, I do hope they eventually make more cheaper Macs with the move to Apple Silicon. So all in all, Ben, I personally think that this is profound. And also, Tim Cook did mention that we do have Intel-based Macs coming out at the end later this year. A couple of Intel-based Macs coming out later this year, as well as that ARM-based Mac. So Intel isn't completely disregarded. And also all machines right now, all existing Macs that run Intel, they will again continue to be supported for years to come. So that isn't an issue right there. So the machine you just purchased is going to last you for years to come. Is this nice to see this level of transition? It's quite significant. And I have speculation, Ben, and tell me what your opinion is. But I believe the rumored iMacs that are coming out at the end later this year, they were supposed to come out at WWDC, but well, that didn't happen. No hardware. I believe that those iMacs will be Intel-based Macs, or at least the last Intel-based Macs we see. What's your take?
Well, I actually have similar thoughts on that. I think it would be the iMacs would be Intel based, but I would find it odd because the rumors say that they're trying to well, Apple wants to redesign the iMac, and I think with a redesign, that will be really odd for them to shove in an Intel chip. So rather, I'd go further to say that not only would there be an Intel chip inside the redesigned iMacs, but there would also be an ARM variant alongside that Intel based iMac. Completely, it's just pure speculation. I have absolutely no idea. I'm just going about on the fact that it seems very unlikely and unusual that when there's a great redesign, that Apple did not also want to put in their own ARM-based chip inside. It seems a bit odd to me, but of course, nevertheless, very much possible. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. On your comments earlier on the heat dissipation and heat output of the processors, I very much agree. I'm right now on my laptop, and my God, is it hot! And if only Windows could have found a way to make ARM work on Windows a long time ago, and what have we used that instead? They haven't. That's a bit unfortunate on my end, but with the MacBook Air currently having its heat dissipation design in such a way, I would say that that would be one of the excellent candidates to have an ARM chip inside. And we talked about this much, not in one of our previous episodes, but just random pieces of conversation here and there that we have. But they might actually resurrect the 12-inch MacBook. Well, just 12-inch MacBook, the super sleek, thin design that Apple once sold. I didn't like the thing. It was terrible. It was relatively slow. It was huge issues with heat management. But I think that with the ARM-based processors, that it would actually do quite well.
Yeah, I agree with you on that front, because generally, the 12-inch MacBook was a rather controversial Mac, to say the least. It was plagued with a lot of issues, especially as to how slow it was. It was the first and only Mac to not have a fan at all. Apple discontinued the product, but with the introduction of the 12-inch MacBook, it sort of set the stage for where Apple is moving in terms of its design, because Macs after that follow suit in terms of its design and its use case of USB-C. But I think there is a high chance for them to resurrect the 12-inch MacBook and have an ARM-based variant of that, which I think will do very well. In terms of the iMac, you do bring up some interesting points, whereby yes, it's a redesign, so kind of doesn't add up. But at the same time, I feel like the iMacs will be sort of like a last hoo-ha for Intel-based Mac, sort of like this is the last Intel Mac period. So the iMacs will incorporate some of the higher end variants of the Intel chips that are offered right now. So I guess eventually we will see a variant whereby they won't change the design probably, but they'll just switch it to an ARM-based processor. But this is interesting because right now we are at an inflection point for the Mac, and actually I feel like the implications of this will trickle down to the rest of the industry. And I even believe that someday Windows will start to fully push ARM-based machines. Yes, you mentioned the Surface X prior to this. It doesn't work really well because of its lack of optimization. But I feel eventually Windows will pick up, and it's a win-win for both sides. But I'm genuinely excited to see where Apple takes this in the long run. And that's pretty much it.
Yes, well, I think that comment on the future of Surface Pro X and its successors will be a very intriguing one to watch. We will watch its career with great interest. But what about you, ladies and gentlemen? Like, what do you think? Are you on the iOS 14 developer beta? If you are, how is it like? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it slow? Is it stable? Is it smooth? And what are your thoughts on this huge redesign with macOS and Apple's introduction of their new silicon? While we find it personally fascinating, we would like to hear your thoughts nonetheless. And are you excited for Apple's upcoming machines? Intel or ARM-based, I think it's really exciting to see where things will go. I think it's a really exciting year for Apple. Not so much for Google, unfortunately, but a very exciting year for Apple. And well, that's all we have for today. We would like you to join us, to follow us, and to comment in our social media feeds. Let us know of what you think and any comments and suggestions you have for us in the future. You could even suggest topics of discussion for us to talk about. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for viewing the Silicon Syndicate. See you next time.